I'd like to, I'd like to get your attention for a couple of moments to please have an opportunity to introduce the panelists on the Labour panel for the Work and Disability Conference. The order of speakers is going to, we're going to start with Dana Howes, who's a postdoctoral fellow at Memorial University, who is our researcher, and you're going to knock him dead, right?
Sure, yep.
And then we're going to have Debbie Colson and Joe Dowdell from the Operating Engineers, Local 793 in Ontario. Then Nikki Lundquist from Unifor. Nikki is a lawyer and on staff with Unifor, and she is the staff liaison for people with disabilities. And then Teresa Minette from the Newfoundland and Labrador Federation of Labor. And you're going to talk fast like a Newfoundlander. Okay. Then we're going to have our rapporteur is Nina Hansen from the BC Federation of Labor. I think we have the Labor commentator on the employer panel, Elizabeth Kwan from the CLC, and the employer commentator who's going to make some comments to wrap things up at the end for us is Megan Kelly from CCWR, which I'm getting a good lesson in acronyms here, is the Canadian Centre for Rehabilitation and Work. Just to kick things off, I guess, I didn't properly introduce Debbie and Joe Dowdell from the Operating Engineers. Debbie is the manager of Member and Social Services. From the locals, she deals with members and their compensation and right to work, return to work issues. And Joe is the government relations guy. He's been their training guy, and since his very serious accident, he's been with the union, and he's got not just experience at helping people, he understands this area. So having said all of that, construction is a really mixed bag area. I come from construction. My name's Bob Blakely. Our employer base, there is roughly 8% of the Canadian population works in the construction industry. We have 30% of injuries and accidents. So that's pretty disproportionate. And we're an industry where 80% of all employers have 10 or less employees. This means they do not have a human resources department. They do not have any other function other than we're putting in pipe today. And the job interview someone gets for a job normally consists of, have you got a ticket, and do you have a pickup truck so you can get yourself to work? Difficult because the degree of sophistication isn't always there. Frequently, smaller owners and even some medium-sized and larger owners find it very convenient to adopt this attitude. I paid my WSIB or WCB premiums, isn't that enough? That is an attitude that is problematic in the area, and it is a bar to getting people to accommodate, and it is a bar to even to things like accessibility. The truth is, Bill 81, which just passed, gets you in the door, but it doesn't get you a job. We need to think about how we can accommodate workers in workplaces that are transient. That's our case in construction. Some of the other people have different examples, and they'll talk about them. We'll also talk about the role of the union in employment and re-employment. Now, all of you who are in the union movement know that we are pristine and there is nothing we ever do that's wrong. But the truth is, we are a fundamental bar in a number of workplaces to people being re-employed. Sometimes we say, well, we'd love to give that person this job, but you know what? Just can't do it because of seniority. Gee, we're going to bargain in the collective agreement and we just can't do it here. Or it is look, it's a great job. We've only got one tool crib. Good old Fred's been there for a very long time. We can't do anything. We have to find better ways to deal with employment and re-employment. In an industry like construction, which is transitory, it is more difficult, and I think you'll find from a couple of the panelists, from Debbie and Joe at least, that you have to go the extra mile in order to get people back to work. And sometimes that falls on the union to provide either the training or the accommodation. Can the government help? Well, I think this is one of the things we want to do, is hold government's feet to the fire. So let me conclude sort of the introduction portion by saying we can all do better, and it behooves us to do so. So now on with the panel. Research first. The hook comes after 5 minutes. Dana?
Okay, thank you. I was asked to speak a little bit about what the research says about the role of unions in the employment or re-employment of people with disabilities. And as you may expect, the research suggests that unions play a critical role in this, in engaging people with disabilities in work. First, unions offer protection and support. Research suggests that the security and stability that unions offer workers through collective bargaining can have what they call a rights facilitating effect. And so what that means basically is that workers feel protected enough to safely speak up at work and to claim their rights without fear of retribution or being punished somehow by their employer, either through being fired or given bad or fewer shifts. And we can see this effect in the research that shows unionized workers are more likely to refuse unsafe work, they're more likely to report work-related injury and illness, they're more likely to file compensation claims, and they're more likely to maintain the status of a claimant for longer than their non-unionized counterparts. And these studies argue that the union's support sort of validates these practices on part of workers and allows these practices such as reporting and filing claims to be seen as legitimate rather than as deviant or abnormal. And indeed, the literature shows that unionized workers do have better return to work outcomes. And the factors that the research has documented that's associated with reduced absences and better return to work outcomes include the tendency for unionized workplaces to typically have more formalized disability management policies. And unionized workplaces tend to have a greater likelihood of using proactive measures, such as making adjustments to working hours, transferring employees to other work, and offering light duty.
Is that because they're larger employers, or is that because they have more sophisticated systems?
It's the presence of the union, I believe, that pushes for these sorts
Good
of...
Good answer.
Yeah. Which is oftentimes associated with the larger workplace, of course. That said, there is some suggestion in the literature that union status may impede workplace accommodations, and this has to do with the employer's duty to accommodate, which means they look at individualized interventions in the workplace to accommodate a worker with disability. However, collective bargaining agreements are designed to protect collective employee interests, so it creates a bit of a tension. So employers may have less leeway in modifying a job or a work process if it entails substantially changing the terms and conditions of work that are included in the bargaining agreement. So in addition to giving workers job security through collective bargaining, unions also influence return to work and work engagement of people with disabilities directly through assisting them with compensation claims and return to work processes. And in my doctoral research, where I interviewed injured workers, they spoke a lot about the critical role of unions in their return to work process and in their compensation claim. They spoke about the deep knowledge they had around rights and the process because of their connection to their union. And several of the workers in my research had become health and safety reps with their union or union stewards. Some other workers in my research, however, felt that their union was notably unhelpful, saying that the union didn't stay on top of their claim, sort of gave them the runaround, took a month or two to file a grievance, those sorts of things. One person even said her union refused to offer support because her claim wasn't legitimate or substantiated by medical reports. But even those who felt the union wasn't helpful in their individual claim, they still felt the job security offered by the union status of their workplace. Some of the workers in my study also mentioned that their connection to the union meant they locked horns with management, and they felt in some cases that management didn't like them because of their affiliation with the union. And this nods to the possible and documented frictions between employers and unions on workplace matters, including work disability prevention. But despite these tensions, there are some calls in the literature for unions and management to work together around work disability prevention, to adopt a culture of accommodation and inclusion, and possibly even bring in other professionals, such as service providers and healthcare professionals, around negotiating contracts to make sure the needs of persons with disabilities are met in those agreements. So provisions concerning flexible work hours, benefits, and sick leave, for example, should be negotiated with disabled workers in mind. And as much as possible, unions and employers should try to anticipate workplace accommodations that might violate the collective agreement. So, for example, provisions around seniority might come in conflict with a move to accommodate a disabled worker. And they should build in necessary provisions in language where possible to remove any ambiguity and, as much as possible, foster an inclusive culture. So while research, there's a lot of opportunities for research to support this strategy through the measurement and accountability pillar. I think one really great sort of avenue of research is to look more at the existing and possible collaborations between unions and employers, and to identify the challenges and successes that would contribute really nicely to this strategy in regards to promoting and strengthening partnerships to achieve disability-confident and inclusive workplaces.
Thank you. Just like unionized construction, you're ahead of time and you're under budget. Okay, I'm going to turn this over to Debbie. She's going to talk about the construction experience for a lot of people.
Thank you, Bob. Joe and I looked at the plan and we decided to attack the pillars. So we're going to split that up. I'm going to take pillar number 1, and the one thing, design and accessibility. In the construction industry, it's critical that the manufacturers are involved in that process. I'll give you an example of noise-induced hearing loss. It's the #1 non-fatal occupational disease that is 100% preventable. The crane rental manufacturers, they're working towards adding extra insulation in the cabs and changing the location of the engine with the focus on reducing noise emissions. So again, anytime that we can work with the manufacturer to prevent, that's good. Support to the employers. As Bob mentioned, the majority of the construction employers employ under 20 people. And so it's very difficult for an employer to provide temporary modified work, yet alone permanent accommodated work. When modified work isn't available, typically the worker will go through retraining for a new occupation, and that comes with its additional own challenges. I'm going to limit my statements here just to the return to work process, not retraining. Culture change. Changing the DNA of the construction industry is a large-scale undertaking, and admittedly, we have a long way to go. Non-filing, non-reporting, signing away your rights. These are things that the construction employers are doing so that claims aren't filed. Again, it's complex, I understand that, but we need to get those small construction employers hooked up with either the medium size or the large size so that they can provide some resources. The one thing that I want to say that's good with the culture change that I've noticed is that typically the building trades, they carve out their own jurisdiction and then they protect it, right? Jurisdictional disputes.
Like grim death.
Yes. When it comes to injured workers, we are working together to see if we can keep the injured worker within the building trades in some capacity, and I think that's really good. And Joe's going to now take over.
Sure, I only have 2 minutes. I'll do the partnership portion as well. Just for a plug for the union, we are a very large local. We cover the province of Ontario. We have 15,000 members. And we also have about 1,000 apprentices within the system. So it's made up of crane operators and heavy equipment. We have 2 very large training facilities, one in Oakville, Ontario. That's where our head office is for the union. And our other training facility is just south of here in Morrisburg, Ontario, where we have 160 acres, and that's where we do our heavy equipment training. The reason I'm bringing up training is the fact that everything that we do, that's probably the highlight of the union itself. But we do also introduce our training facilities to the WSIB staff. We've had them there many times, where they actually look at our training facility and what we do for our training standards, and also how we incorporate that into the apprenticeship programs. We've also developed a 3-day assessment that will help an injured worker and work with WSIB or a third party to actually do an assessment on the individual's needs after he's been injured at work. So there's another example of us partnering with the Ministry of Training, colleges and universities, and also with WSIB and also our training standards with the local itself. Just a couple of real positive experiences where we've had crane apprentices that have been injured. One in particular, he had injured his leg at work and actually had to have it amputated below the knee. And because of that, obviously he still wanted to be a crane operator, but we had a new assessment. And what we did was we actually brought him into the training facility. We also had WSIB consultants show up, and they did evaluation on that to make sure that the individual could actually do the work. So at the end of the assessment, he did continue with his apprenticeship. He did complete it, and he is a licensed crane operator today and doing a very good job, and still with in the scope of what he wanted to do as a crane apprentice and become a crane operator prior to his accident. And one other person was a female where she had a hearing impairment, and we made accommodations for that too at training, where we made sure that the individual could be in the classroom, and we made accommodations for that. And also, because of the impairment, we also made changes to the cab where the actual speaker was for the person that had the impairment, and it worked. And today she's a crane operator. So by working together, partnering, and making sure that we take care of our members, we actually were very, very successful.
Thanks, Joe. Okay, Nikki?
So I had prepared remarks, and I'm not going to use them because
That's the best.
because that's what happens sometimes. And I'm not going to use them because I've had some really interesting conversations today, and I think this might be helpful. So I was really glad to hear the research, because I've been saying for a long time, it's not my experience that unions are impediments to disability in the way that we're perceived to be out in the public, and in terms of partnerships that we'd like to form with people. We have found frequently that has been raised as a concern about unions, that somehow the very existence of a union in a workplace actually creates an impediment to employing workers with disabilities. And the reason that's interesting is, if it were true, then it would seem that there would be fewer workers with disabilities employed in unionized workplaces, and that's not the case. There are more workers with disabilities employed in unionized workplaces than in non-union workplaces. So employers are selling us a line, and we're all believing it for some reason. So thank you for that, because I think it's important and really helpful. That being said, I'm not going to pretend that unions have been stellar in respect of people with disabilities. So what unions are getting good at is dealing with the legal, the bare legal minimums, which is what accommodation is, right? That is the bare minimum that law requires us to do. It is not something we should strive for. It is something that should just happen as a matter of course, and we're getting there. I mean, my experience as a human rights lawyer on staff with Unifor tells me that we've made some pretty big strides in the last 15 years on this front. But I will say that unions are only as strong as the representatives that they elect, and if you don't elect good representatives, then you don't get the kind of service that everybody should have, particularly people with disabilities. So here is where we have been deficient as a union. I think my boss is in the room. I'm probably getting fired. I think it's okay. If you need a lawyer, call me. Yeah, okay, fair enough.
That's right, I'm a union lawyer, you can call me.
Okay, so I'll find work,
So
it's gonna be fine.
We've got them overwhelmed with lawyers.
Okay, so I'm gonna find work and it's gonna be okay when I say these things. So we have undertaken an audit of Unifor. And it was an equity audit to try to understand where we were failing. And we were failing in several areas. We've done some great things too. That's me trying to save my job. But we actually have. We've done some really good things. But one of the areas where we have been deficient is actually bargaining equity. So everybody knows that there's employment equity legislation, and everybody knows that nobody uses it. Right? Like, it sits there, so it's policy, but it's not action. And it's an incredible tool that nobody uses because it has no teeth, and it's a challenge. So there was a discussion amongst our equity committee, particularly our Workers with Disability Equity Committee. 2 members are here with us. And they determined that they had priorities. And one of the priorities they would like to see is hiring of people with disabilities, because although we had a significant number of people with disabilities in our workplace, they were people who were developing disabilities as a result of the work or as part of life. So, oh my gosh, really? I'm going to ignore that and keep going really fast.
That's right, when in doubt, talk fast.
Right? So we were not doing well in terms of hiring people with disabilities, so reaching beyond the people that were existing in that workplace. So we decided we were going to develop a program to do exactly that. And so in the last 8 months, Unifor has looked at over 200 of its collective agreements to see what kind of bargaining language we have. And when we found very little other than accommodation kinds of clauses, we started looking at other unions, and we found very little other than accommodation kinds of clauses. And so we have decided that we will create a program for bargaining disability. And here's where my ask comes in. So this program is going to be about developing bargaining language. It's about creating potentially a disability advocate in the workplace so that people with disabilities who get hired have support. We have a program like that in our women's department, a women's advocate program, so I think we're going to loosely model it on that. We are holding meetings in February, and if you want to attend, let us know because we'll find space for you. And that is to get ideas and shared understandings and knowledge and share best practices so that we can develop something that is useful and strong. And the other part of this is we recognize that we need to have a cultural shift within. And so in order to get our people ready for this idea that we want to bargain this, we've created a video of workers with disabilities in the union, showing them in all of their capacities. So creating that kind of cultural understanding that there is capacity that they don't see and that they shouldn't make assumptions, and that's working.
And a tiny bit of enforceability, too.
That's it. Well, and so one of the things that we actually really need from people are, we hear all the time that we have to make a business case for disability, right? It can't be just about, we want you to hire people with disabilities because it's the right thing. We have to make a business case for it. So we need data, we need knowledge, and if you have it, we would welcome it. Thank you.
Very good, Joan. When I introduced Teresa, I skipped over something, and I did it on purpose. And her bio basically says, assists with return to work for union and non-union employees, works with workers' compensation, lobbying for the inclusion of domestic violence and protections, and for mental health to be covered by workers' compensation. That is the sort of stuff the union should do for everybody. Good for you.
Thank you very much. I've been asked to speak, I guess, today on, as my colleague said, all the issues and how we can prevent this as a union. In Newfoundland and Labrador right now, we have what we call the PRIME program, and it's an incentive-based rebate program for employers to facilitate return to work and safety in their employment. What we found, we did some research, what we found was that this was actually had a negative effect. It was working backwards. The OHS component of the incentive program It was a tick box incentive program, and employers were ticking the boxes but not actually implementing safety. The second component was an experience program, and the employers were responsible for getting injured workers back to work fast and safely. They forgot the safety part. What we've seen is that not only do we have claim suppression in Newfoundland big time now, we have employers that are fostering claim suppression, and injured workers are getting injured and not getting compensated for it, so they end up moving from a compensation system to a disability without any insurance. So it's become a real problem in Newfoundland, and we've seen the employers received, I think it was $140 million rebate, and this was employers who had caused fatalities in the workplace. So we're lobbying now for the dismantlement or at least the revamping of this PRIME program. PRIME programs, it stands for Prevention, Recovery, Insurance Management Employees Program. It did none of that. So we're actually meeting with them sometime this month, and it's the employers, Newfoundland Federation of Labour, and Workers' Compensation coming to the table. So we have all the right parties there coming to the table, but it's been a struggle with regards to, I guess, getting everybody on board when you have an incentive program that provides $140 million to your bigger employers in your province. And what I heard throughout this day is that their smaller employers are not. They're the ones we should be targeting, and with this program, it actually, there's no incentive at all for the employers to go on board to meet the two incentives in the program. They don't get rebates, basically. So we don't have them on board for hire and disability, and they don't even have any, benefits to this program. So currently now, the Newfoundland Federation of Labour, we did our research. We're looking at the Saskatchewan model with respect to having OH&S clinics, and you only get an incentive if you have an audit is actually done. We can come in, we can do your audit, and it's done independently rather than tick the boxes. And the injured workers actually have.
Does independent mean by an independent agency?
The independent agency.
Contractor from across the street
No.
come over and sign yours off?
No, independent agency that will be chosen by Workers' Compensation Board rather than the employer. And then you will get your rebate based on if you actually fulfilled all your obligations as an employer. And the other part of this program would allow injured workers and employees to be part of this program. So it's taken away, the disconnect between employees not even being part of it. And I guess the other big issue with regards to the safety component of this is that the OH&S, the audit now that they're currently doing in St. John's, Newfoundland, it's just tick box. So we're hoping that we're going to move from, tick box to actually implementing an on-site audit. That's it.
Thanks very much, Teresa. Okay, Megan, you're the employer's Trojan horse. Now you've heard all our secrets, and would you like to make some comments?
So my name is Megan Kelly, and I'm the National Corporate Relations Manager with the Canadian Council on Rehabilitation and Work. And you're probably, you're all here to listen to a union perspective as it relates to this national strategy. So you're probably wondering why I was sitting up here. But I have been lucky enough in my role at CCRW that I've been able to connect with unions in Canada from the perspective as the union itself as the employer. So a lot of the things that you've all said up here today have resonated with me in a sense that there's a lot of things that unionized setting is doing right, that the national strategy can sort of implement in terms of return to work, formal disability management, being proactive, utilizing skills and flexibility in that return to work plan. But also recognizing that, there's a large area for collaboration and partnership that's really important to move this forward. And I think it's bigger than, unions, the workers and the management, but it also incorporates, service agencies and non-unionized employers in terms of the transfer of knowledge and what's working in recruitment and retention for persons with disabilities, as well as, areas around accommodation. So really great to hear what you had to say, Nikki, in terms of what you've recognized in terms of, where you need to do better. And I don't think those things are uncommon, even outside of the unionized workplace, which is, probably some of the things that you heard today in the employer panel. I saw you writing some things down. So, just trying to bring a perspective from outside of, the unionized workplace, but recognizing that in my conversations with union as employers, it's really the importance of ensuring that, internally that they have the knowledge and the information and the education in order to project that outwards, to the members and the people working within the union to ensure that, they're starting from the inside first and projecting that outward in a way that's going to benefit, all workers in Canada. So that's mine, and I'm under time because everyone else is over. So.
Okay, this is the point in which the panelists can argue with each other if they want, or have some comments on something someone said that they think needs to be elaborated on a bit. Anybody?
I have one question for Joe. You had shared a couple of success stories in terms of that return to work. What do you do in terms of sharing those stories, perhaps with other unions or other workplaces? In terms of allowing people to see what things have worked.
That's a good question. I think collectively, I think that's something that we should be doing a lot better. We don't share that good communication the way we should. I wish we had an open forum, or certainly through the building trades, we would do that. I think a lot of the unions' training centers, especially the training centers, the large ones, they have the capability to do that. And I know for Local 793, we have a whole department, and Debbie is our manager there, and she does a fantastic job in her team ensuring that we protect the workers' rights, and we try to get them back to doing the job that they were doing before, or at least if there is a modification that it's close to what they were doing. Through the building trades, I know, Bob, we should be doing a lot more than, and not only through the building trades, but through the central building trades, through our provincial bodies that we do have, through the Ministry of Training. Now there's another change of government, so they've gone back to their old name of Ministry of Training, College and Universities. Through the College of Trades, I know that we were doing a lot of trying to incorporate that stuff that we are doing, the success stories and sharing that. But that's been wound down, so now we have to wait and see what's going to be next. But you're right, we should be doing a lot more than we are doing, definitely.
Do you know what? I really like your point there, Joe. If you looked at the number of our trades that have welding in it, everybody has a problem with the welding hard hat combination, right? Yes. And people always have neck problems as a result of it. So why can't we get together, and we've got lots of resources, why can't we fix it? Is every collaboration that we're going to do dependent on having a relationship with somebody? Or is there some way we can engender collaboration to push it forward? So that's a question to anybody. How do we get better collaboration? Thinking out loud, I'll bet you a whole bunch of the people you do, the process operators you've got, they're in the same ranks as Unifor, they're the same trades. We've got lots of people that are in the same trades. How do we get better collaboration, and how do we get some relationships built that will allow us to do something? Go for it.
It'd be nice to have a national collective agreement. Like, I know we do have a lot out there where we have to start putting some hard language, and I hate to say that, but some hard language and enforcement also into safety sensitive areas where we know that, like hard hat, for example, where we know that there is a standard through the IHSA. There's standards that are out there. Our good friends at CSA, they do great work where we have Canadian Standards Association, where we have set standards, but that we all reference through OSHA. But there is an avenue that we can probably do it a lot quicker without having to spend a lot of money, but at the end of the day, it will be successful.
Anybody else on that one? Should we collaborate on some of this stuff? Should we make the world, can we make the world better?
Absolutely, we're going to do that, Bob. We are going to collaborate. Anytime we collaborate with, even us being here from we're like fish out of water in a sense from the building trades. Coming here and listening to what's being said here gives me hope. Gives me hope that in the building trades, we are going to change the culture and we are going to have employers wanting to look at employing people with disability as opposed to kicking them to the curb, because that's what happens in our industry. We as the union, we have a hiring hall, and I believe most building trades do have a hiring hall agreement. So I know in our hiring hall agreement, there's not a place for you if you have a disability. And I'm ashamed to say that, but we should collaborate with the other building trades and find out how we can have a list that is inclusive of all people.
Go ahead, Nikki.
So I'm not going to specifically speak to that. I'm just going to say that that is part of a cultural shift, and that cultural shifts. So I think one of the interesting things about unions is, I don't want to say they cannibalize one another.
Just
But
once in a while.
Yeah, but there is a competitiveness there, but that suddenly can't say competitiveness twice, works both ways, so that if a union actually develops something positive, other unions are really inclined to follow suit and to try to extend and expand on that. So I actually think that in that way you can create a value shift that creates part of that cultural shift that we're talking about. But I did want to return to the idea of sharing of success stories. So Unifor actually had a really, it'll be a short story, interesting experience this summer. So it was almost by happenstance that it happened. So we were starting to engage in this project, and we had Holland Bloorview Rehabilitation Hospital come and give a presentation to us on a program they had hiring young workers with disabilities. And after they gave the presentation, we made a pitch to the National Union to hire a young worker with a disability as an intern for the summer, a paid internship. And we did so, and he was the one that engaged in a significant amount of the research in terms of the union's collective agreements and doing the audit of those. So it was a positive in terms of we actually put equity into action, hiring a worker with disability, but it actually was a positive thing in terms of the union environment because there was nobody in our environment that had those kinds of profound disabilities before. It's just not something that we have seen. And it changed the perception of capacity. He had incredible capacity. Honestly, he's smarter than me, and I just didn't tell him. Just really skilled, smart, capable young guy. But the problem with the story that I'm telling is, yes, it was a great story in terms of he produced great work. We ended up with a great employee. I think the union is likely to hire again in a similar capacity. But it was by happenstance, right? So if we didn't actually happen to have that connection with Holland Bloorview, we would never have met this individual. We would never have had the benefit of that experience. Would never have triggered the shift that is occurring. And that's a problem because one of the things that I think is a little bit, I don't want to say deficient, but perhaps needs to be addressed in the strategy is how do we actually engage unions in this process? Because what unions have is access to workplaces. So where a community agency or a social service agency is going out knocking one door at a time, we can hit 500 or 600 or whatever. We can make it a priority in our bargaining. We have that kind of collective power, and it shouldn't happen by happenstance. So if you're in a community agency, I have to strongly encourage you to contact us and let us know what you offer and how we can match skill sets to workers and jobs to the people that you know or that you represent, because I think that that's actually where there's a bit of a disconnect.
Yeah, it's like the community benefit agreements that people want to put in place where you actually hire people for what they can deliver, no matter what community they come from. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, the floor is open for questions. See, lots of people. Do we have a mic, or are we going to speak in stentorian tones? Okay, you were first, sir. In a peach-colored shirt? Yes, sir.
My name is Carlos Sosa.
Sorry. peach-colored shirt. You were close, though.
Okay. My name is Carlos Sosa. I'm here
Okay, sorry.
on behalf of Inclusion in Winnipeg, and I just want to make a statement to follow up on what Unifor said. I am also a union member, a person living with a disability. And in Manitoba, my union, UFCW Local 832, just negotiated a collective agreement with Loblaws, where they also agreed to do a pilot project to retain and hire people with disabilities. So I just want to put that on the record right now, that it's not just Unifor, that it's also UFCW. There may be other unions, so I just want to put that on the record. And I think what I'd also suggest that maybe we should be also pondering is maybe creating some kind of a collaborative network of unions that are negotiating these agreements, so we actually learn from each other, so we're not operating just in silos, so that we're all working together to improve the lives of people with disabilities and workers with disabilities. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, let's try the gentleman with the peach-colored shirt now. If that is peach.
I'm peachy. I'm Steve Mantis with the Ontario Network of Injured Workers Groups. I have a comment or two and then a question. With our organization, about 10, 15 years ago, one of our annual conferences, we did a quick little survey. Are you a union member, and are you back to work? And 90% of the folks that were union members were back to work. If you weren't a union member, it was 25%. So right there, that told an awfully big story for us, because once you have people behind you, you have a much better opportunity to negotiate your reemployment. The second is an example from a sawmill in Grand Cache, Alberta. I was out there to talk to them about their, actually it was the National Day of Mourning, and I spent a couple of days. They have a joint ergonomics committee. And this is a sawmill that never made a profit. They were always struggling. They developed this program to say, what can we do to make sure that people with varying strengths and weaknesses are accommodated? And a simple process, but mentioning kind of working with the manufacturer, they identified in the saw booth, it was built for tall men.
Yeah.
Well, those short women were getting hurt regularly. They sent 2 of their hourly employees back to the manufacturer, remanufactured that saw booth so it was adjustable, and did this in a number of different parts of their operation, and gosh, they became a profitable organization. The third really is a question, and I'm wondering, it just popped into my mind, that the dynamics of negotiating a collective agreement is one where you have to give up a number of your goals and demands to reach that agreement. Once the agreement is in place, it oftentimes seems like the parties and the union, as we're talking about now, then feels like they have to defend that agreement, even though sometimes they gave up what they wanted to get, but they kind of go, well, we can't fight for that because we didn't get it in negotiation. Is that observation accurate, and how can we overcome and pursue our dreams beyond what we can get the employer to agree to?
Okay, that sounds like a legal question, and there is a good legal answer. The law in Weber basically says that if you have a collective agreement, it subsumes the rights that are in the collective agreement, and those other workplace employment rights need to be tried there rather than in some other forum.
So I'm not going to disagree with that. That is what Weber says. But just because bargaining is over and you have a collective agreement, that doesn't mean discussion about change in workplaces stops at that time. So you can have midterm kind of agreements. It happens all of the time in terms of, temporary lines they set up, for example, or
Sure.
workplace accommodation programs, those kinds of things. So to me, just because you weren't successful in bargaining, it doesn't mean you can't try it another way in terms of, you're going to have to build the business case for it, right? You're going to have to convince the employer it's something they want to do. You can't make them do it because it's not a right you've bargained. But if there was something that I didn't get in bargaining that was important in terms of accommodating workers with disabilities, for example, or hiring workers with disabilities, I would keep at it for the next 3 years or 4 years or however long the agreement was.
And that includes things like you were talking about at the sawmill. It's changing the way the work is done, changing the tools, modifying the workplace, modifying the work practices. Those are things that we can advocate for, and at a pretty low level. I mean, the job steward should be able to say, you know what, we could do a lot more if you did whatever. And guys who have bad hands, well, we'll mechanize their shears instead of making them work with hand tools.
And just to speak further to that, my experience is that even though something has been taken from a collective agreement, and especially with return to work and accommodation, if it's been taken away, that means it was there previous. And a lot of times if you go back to the table and you discuss how successful it was, even though it was taken away, a lot of times you do like a backdoor agreement, and they will do it.
Over here, I think there's a question over here. Oh, I'm sorry, was somebody else want to get in? Go for it.
I just wanted to make a comment around that as well. If we could actually, we also have health and safety committees as well that we have set up on large job sites as well. So that's a good opportunity where you bring something forward, and certainly the Health and Safety Committee is their obligation actually to address that and bring that to management and bring that to the union, because all these union reps there as well. So there is avenues even after the collective agreement is made. And one thing about it, every 3 years, it can be brought up again, and with a smile.
Ontario Public Service Employees Union. I work with the Ontario government directly, and what I'm hearing is really good, but it's not my reality on an everyday. I do all the accommodations, the return to works, the LTIPs, and the Ontario government has the golden standard. We have everything, like we have all the accessibilities, we have all the policies, everything you need, but they're not followed. We have to all the time. Today, twice I get texts because I have to grieve today because they're not doing the accommodations. We have to grieve. We always have to threaten the Ontario Human Rights Code. They won't do the duty to accommodate. And the funny part is, most of my members work for the Ontario Disability Support Program. So they won't even accommodate their own members with flex time, and most of them are clerical, so it's desks or computer systems or like different things like that. And this is the Ontario government. And so if they won't even do that, how do we get the others to buy in if we can't even get our own Ontario government to buy in? I've been doing this for 10 years. I'm getting tired, but I'm not going to stop because it's this is what I love to do. It's my passion. But if the Ontario government won't even do it, how do we get the others to buy in? Because I am fighting every day to get just the duties to accommodate. And I'm always talking about Human Rights Code and telling them, you know, the thresholds that they can't call undue hardship. The Ontario government, well, they are broke, but they're not going to go broke if they have to do the duty to accommodate. So it's very difficult as a union member, and I heard their research, but it's not our reality out there. And I also talk to, because I'm on the Disability Caucus, I also talk to a lot of our BPS, our LCBOs, all the other locals, and we're 130 members, 30,000 members. It's not the reality in our union, and we're all at the forefront doing it every day, and it's just not working out, these accommodations.
Makes me feel better about our rough and ready tobacco chewing construction industry. Anybody want to respond to that?
Yeah, if you don't mind. You know, it's hard for me to sit up here because the reality is in the building trades is that although the WSIB in 2017 said that 91% of injured workers were back to work with no wage loss within 12 months, we have to look at what the measurement is. You know, it's pretty easy to keep an injured worker at work for 12 months. What happens after 12 months, because that's the sustainability piece that we have, or we want. So we have been keeping a database of our members' experience post-injury, and 80% will go back within the year. They actually very rarely miss any time. One day, the day of accident, and then they're back to some kind of work. Interestingly, by the time we get to 2 years, of the workers, 80% will not be working with the injury employer. 80%. So no, the reality is that they're not returning to work. I'm sorry to say, but I came up here with a really good attitude today, trying to be positive, because Joe said if I wasn't, he was gonna kick me to the curb. But no, it's not good. So yeah.
It's compounded by the fact that construction's a transitory industry. Most jobs don't last more than a year, and you can bet the accommodations are on which layoff, the first or the last.
Right, but you say that, Bob, but you look at the longevity of our employees with the employers, it's long. The projects end, but they bring those workers to other projects.
Yeah.
And we have to start looking at that pattern a little bit more.
Over here? Oh, my goodness. So you're, all right, as long as you're designating them, we'll do that.
Hi.
Go ahead.
We
Go
just
ahead,
wanted
Nick.
to say something about the Ontario government situation, and I'm not talking about the current Ontario government situation. I could say lots about that. Yeah, so I'm just going to ignore who's in government and say the following. So although I appreciate that what you're saying is it's challenging to get accommodations, and it often feels like you're constantly having to threaten and to file grievances or pursue human rights claims, you know, the tools we have to actually enforce the rights that we have. I suspect that if you did an audit of your workplace, you would find a significant number of people actually have some kind of accommodation. So I'm not saying it's appropriate accommodation. I'm not saying more accommodation isn't needed. I'm not saying they're doing a great job. I'm saying sometimes we get a bit of a tainted view because we live in the frustration of it all of the time. So I can't think of a workplace, and I'm not saying Unifor is the best model because we have some really great return to work programs in certain places, really great people, and then we have other places where there are some challenges. And I think that's probably true of every workplace, whether it's in government or in the private sector or anywhere else. So, but practically speaking, I really do think if you did an audit, you would still, look, don't get me wrong, you're still gonna be upset because you're still gonna be frustrated, but you might be less frustrated because the enforcement of those rights actually does work. Not always, but largely it works. So there are programs where the entire government is buying in though, and I know that because of my, so it might not be in your workplace and it might not be all over, but we can talk after because we could talk about this for a really long time. There are problems and there are programs that are working.
Okay, death to the Ontario government, on to the next question,
Okay.
please.
It's not a question so much as it is a statement.
Yes, please.
I just wanted to commend the folks on the panel today. You've done a really great job sitting in a room full of union workers and activists and like really vocal, passionate union activists. I also want to commend the CCRW and all the NGOs and nonprofits that sit here today with us, trying to create, more collaboration between all stakeholders. But I also know that change happens one action at a time, and Carlos Sosa, who spoke first on the mic, alluded to that, to a collective agreement that recently was done in Manitoba by UFCW 832, and the language for that is literally 2 sentences. So if I can just say it to you, they've recently signed it, and it says, with Loblaw, by February 28, 2019, the union and the company will work to establish a joint employment project to hire and support persons with disabilities in the workplace. The objective is to hire workers who identify as having a disability, either intellectual, cognitive, or physical. The parties will work towards ensuring the workers' success in attaining and retaining gainful employment while integrating the supports and accommodations that the worker needs, including working and social service agencies that currently work with this population. So in a big banner like Loblaw, where we represent thousands and thousands of workers across the country, that's really great gain, and it sets precedents for other collective agreements coming down the pipe. But I also agree with the gentleman on the far right. I'm so sorry, I forgot your name.
Far left, Joe Dowdle.
The importance of training centers and the goal that we have with the training centers, right? Because we have a training center in Quebec that since 2007, 2008 has received funding from the Ministry of Education in order to equip and facilitate 26 or so weeks of training for new Canadians, persons with disabilities, and up until now, they've done this in the form of an internship. So when you're done the 26 weeks, you're hired on as an intern at a banner such as Provigo, Loblaw, Sobeys, and once you're done that internship, which might be about 4 weeks, then you're hired on as a collective, as a member of the union and with accommodations in place. So I just wanted to say that the retention rate of the 140 plus persons with disabilities who have gone through that channel in Montreal has been quite high, such that about 87 of those 140 or so workers have stayed and continued in that type of employment in the retail sector post 6 months, you know, on a long-term measure. And the employers in return gaining confidence on the power of these, of the training center look to the union for that, to fill in that gap. So I totally agree with, you know, Megan, Nikki, and everyone on the panel that collaboration is key. While we differ in how we get there, and who we represent and all these things, I think what we need to celebrate is, or what we need to focus on is, in unison, sending a strong message as a union that, that workers deserve better, and that persons with disability deserve to be accommodated, not sometimes, but all the time. So Aniwik said it, Carl Krieger, and many others. Thanks.
Okay, the next question?
Can I make a quick comment before the next question? I just wanted to thank you for sharing that statement, because I think that also really speaks to collaboration. It identifies all the stakeholders that are really pivotal to make that a success. And you know, the employees, the workers, the management of that Loblaws, and also the support systems that are in place to ensure that, you know, that whole process is supported to be successful, from recruitment to retainment of those persons with disabilities who will be hired.
Hi,
Go ahead, sir.
Brad Durst from the Durham Police Union. First of all, the Durham Regional Police Association, we're a union very much in support of your national strategy. I have an interesting question for the lawyer. I understand fully that once we hire, or once the service hires an individual that became a dues-paying member, my responsibility of representation kicks in. I'll give you an example in the policing world. Auxiliary officers are not represented by the union because they don't pay dues. So if injured on the job, they are covered under WSIB by their legislation, but we don't get involved. So the gentleman back here had a comment that they have a retain over the disabilities and then a higher section in their collective agreement. So my question to the lawyer, I find this fascinating, but I don't know the legal responsibility of pre-employment individuals. If they're not paying member dues, how do you represent them?
Go ahead.
So you don't, generally speaking, unless you bargain something that permits you to do that. So generally speaking, we don't have a say in the hiring unless we bargain it. So if you put it in your collective agreement, then you have a right to have a voice in that process, or have the process look however, you know, you've bargained it. It's one of those challenging things, right? So I'll use pre-employment drug testing as...
Or weld testing, or some of the driver test.
We wouldn't agree to those things. If they were members, we would grieve them, but there's little we can do because they're not yet our members.
If you fail the drug test, or you fail the weld test, or you can't drive the truck, you never became a member of the bargaining unit. If you're never a member of the bargaining unit, you get none of the benefits of the collective agreement.
That's right.
So if I could just add to that, if you don't mind, people, so if you had something like that in your collective agreement, you have to build in some language that says a pre-hire individual has the right then to come to the union, but who's going to pay for the union to fight the fact that you want to see why they didn't get it?
See, in construction, what we have sometimes is if people have to do a welding test or something, we have a provision in there that says they get paid when they're doing the welding test, and they're covered by compensation. So for that brief period, there's some protection for them. But if you don't have a protection, they've got a big handful of nothing.
And also in our collective agreements, it's a little different than what you're saying, but we have pre-apprenticeship.
Yeah.
And when you're pre-apprenticeship, you're not a member of the union yet, But in our collective agreements, we've identified that as a person that is potentially going to be entering the apprenticeship, but they're meaning that they haven't become a union member yet. We have not taken any union dues off them yet, but we will represent them on a job site because that's in the collective agreement.
Yeah, they're waiting to be indentured into the apprenticeship.
Also, too, I
Are we getting pretty close to the Margaret's last? Margaret's the last question we have today? Margaret, if you're the last question, give it.
something?
We're going to hold up the
Just-
stop sign.
Just to speak to,
Go ahead,
just to speak to your question, I guess that's one of the things that we would do with the Newfoundland Federation of Labour, even though someone is not represented by a union, even though they're riding along with the police officer. There is appetite in our workers' compensation legislation. Their volunteers are covered, so we would strongly advocate and fight.
That's in
work
a
for
number
them.
of compensation acts across the country. Margaret?
Thanks. I'm a social researcher, so I take a social viewpoint, and I'm interested in social processes. So I know I'm asking a panel of mostly people in the construction industry, but if you can also think, and maybe not Unifor, but if you can think a bit beyond that industry. In my own research, I frequently came across a conflict that my research participants talked about. They had a chronic illness. They were trying to stay at work, and one of the ways that they did that was by asking for and sometimes getting an accommodation of a job transfer to a different kind of job that was better fit for their health condition. But they often raised an issue that other members of the unions, many of them were unionized, objected to the job transfer because the person getting the accommodation didn't have seniority. So seniority seemed to trump the accommodation process in their
it doesn't in
organization.
law.
Hang on. I know it doesn't in law. So what my interest is the social process of what do you do about this and what happens in your unions if you encounter this, even though it's not lawful. Do you just say it doesn't work in the law, or do you go beyond that and try to work with the situation?
It's dead easy in construction. We don't have seniority.
Right. Most of our collective agreements do not have seniority, but I'll give you an example of, I talked about jurisdiction. So let's say my bulldozer operator can't run his bulldozer for various reasons, but he needs modified work, so maybe a traffic control person, which is the laborers, okay? So when I'm in that meeting, I don't object to that, because that would mean that we're not cooperating in the process. I have to take off my union hat and put it down. What I want to make sure is that that worker is going to safe and suitable and dignified work. At that point, I'll be quite honest, I don't care about that person's union status, okay? It's more about what can we do about getting them back or keeping them at work. So the laborers technically could grieve that, right? Because the operator is now infringing upon that jurisdiction, which is the laborers. We don't. We work together. So mostly it would be a temporary basis. We're always trying to get them back to pre-injury work. So maybe they need to be a traffic control person for a very short time and then transition over back to their heavy equipment job. But if it's permanent, I'm not going to take that person out of the confines of a union environment and say we're not going to work with the laborers. We will actually work with the laborers to get that person into that union. So that's how we deal with it socially.
Go for it.
Because we actually do have a seniority issue, and that gets raised a lot, right? You hear that a lot, this idea that there's a conflict between seniority and accommodation, but I want to say like 97 things about that, and I'm going to say 2. So I think what is challenging is how accommodations are done sometimes. So generally, if an employer tries to impose accommodation on the union environment sorry, there's something floating in front of my eyes, union environment without consulting with the union, it creates significant conflict, and then you get profound resistance to accommodation sometimes. So in our workplaces, we say, you know, you look at somebody's own job, you see if they can do it. If they can't do it, you look in the area they work in, you look in the broader area at open jobs. There's a whole process. And most of this falls down on process. It's not that, you know, when push comes to shove, the law is the law on accommodation, right? There is a duty to accommodate. But I will say this, a lot of really senior people are in accommodated positions. The reason they have the jobs they have is because over time their bodies break down because of the jobs that they do. And so it's not as simple as saying, you know, let's bump somebody out of a job, because it's, when you're talking about industrial environments like that, it's complex. So you might have 25 or 30% of a workplace that's being accommodated. That's not unusual. It's not unusual, and in some places it's upwards of 40%. You know, so to me, this really becomes an issue of, you understand what the law is, but you also understand that the employer's first response initially has been to just impose an obligation to accommodate on the back of somebody else. So an employer's proposed accommodation is, okay, so you don't have to lift, so you're going to do all of his lifting, or you're going to do all of her lifting, and that creates conflict. So to me, this really is about how do you go through the process appropriately to make sure that all of the people in the bargaining unit can manage the situation. It is socialization, it absolutely is. And that has to be process driven. And if it's not, it's going to fail, and it's going to create conflict.
Does that answer your question? Okay. If that's the last question, oh, we have more questions. All right, please go ahead.
I feel like I'm in the line of fire now.
To the first lady that spoke, I think it was the researcher, and I'm sorry, I forgot your name.
Dana? Yeah.
Dana, you talked about seniority, and then you talked about human rights, and I wasn't quite clear. What I thought you were saying was that some people with seniority, that in some unions, you know, they get annoyed, or that seniority trumps with human rights when there's accommodation. Maybe that's not what you said, but that's what I thought I heard. And to my knowledge, human rights trumps. It doesn't, I value my seniority as a union member, as I'm sure thousands of union members do, but where there's an accommodation, human rights trumps all. And I'm just wondering, how old is your data? How many people did you actually survey, or what kinds of workers, and where did you get your data from?
Research that I've done myself. This is sort of a review of the research that could speak to the role of unions. And my point in bringing that up was sort of nodding to the possible sorts of issues that can be considered in the negotiating process. So when thinking about fostering an inclusive workplace, that can be done. There's a role for unions around that in the collective bargaining process, such that when they're negotiating for the various provisions, bearing in mind certain things that can create tensions, such as this issue around seniority and workplace accommodations, and which takes precedent.
We agree with you.
Right, yeah.
I agree. But,
Okay, Nikki?
but if you look at the law, there are no cases that I'm aware of where they've actually removed, so if there's a job that's filled, I've not seen it I mean, it's been done where people have been moved out of jobs voluntarily, but I've never seen a case where they've required somebody to lose their job to accommodate somebody. I've never seen that. So we talk about these things as though they're written in stone and clear as day, and there's lots of shady area in this.
We at one, we're at the third last question. Okay, brother, go ahead.
So one of the things that wasn't brought up is the hiring models done by workplaces. Is employers like to inflate the qualifications for the positions. And sometimes when you have to explain to the employer what a bona fide requirement is, it's kind of frustrating, but I have to do that a lot. And I think our unions need to bring back bona fide requirements of job postings and qualifications so that they don't inflate it so they can get the best candidate brother-in-law into the position, right? So
Yeah, you describe, you write the job description, so it only fits one guy in the local.
I think we all agree with you.
Yeah, I think that if you have this, if you have the necessary skills and training, you should be considered for the job, depending on your place is on the out of work list or however the hiring is handled. Oh, we're done? All right. Ladies and gentlemen, brothers and sisters, a round of applause for your panel.